This table saw came from a sponsor. The company that this saw is from shall remain unnamed in this video because I did do some sponsored videos with them with some other tools. I was going to do a paid review for this saw, but when I looked at it, I realized it was not going to go well. I've been agonizing over whether I should review this saw or not because it's really not a nice thing to do to a company that gives you a free saw, and that's why I won't name the company. Even before I got the saw out of the box, I took the insert out and had a look in here. And I saw this part here, and I'm going, hey, that doesn't look straight. That looks like it's a little bit bent. And then I looked down in the shroud, and it's like, hey, there's a hole in the bottom of the dust shroud. Well, that's kind of useless. Isn't the dust supposed to go out the hole in the back? And then I turned the blade a little bit, and I saw that it wobbles. Now, I sent the original one back, and they sent me another one. This one is much better. But the way this arbor is made, it's not prone to terrible precision. What keeps the blade flat and not wobbling is the precision of this part. If this part is a little bit crooked, then the blade ends up going a little bit like this as it turns. And the problem with this is, I think it's actually a cast part, and it just sits straight up against the ball bearing here, and so any slight imperfection on here will be multiplied by 20 times by the time you get out here. So if this is not completely flat, that causes blade wobble. This is a problem with most job site saws in that this part actually is loose from the arbor. On cabinet maker saws and on hybrid table saws, this part tends to be bonded tightly to the arbor so that it doesn't have any play. Even though this part was hard to push on, once it's here, actually it does have a little bit of play. I can rock it back and forth. And the only thing that makes it rigid is when it gets pushed up against the bearing by the blade and the other flange. The saw has a riving knife which you can lower a fair bit or raise it quite a ways up. This is the first time I actually put the guard on this saw. It's not something I would normally use, but the way the riving knife goes up and down is actually quite nice. Not everything about this saw is terrible. But for now, let's get back to the things that are terrible about this saw. So this here has got a hole in the bottom of it, which totally defeats the idea of hooking up a vacuum cleaner here. But when I looked in the box, there was a piece of plastic in there, and I realized that was a cover that was meant to be on here, and you can see there's a screw with a bit of plastic that just came off. So there was a cover that's meant to go on here, and it broke on both saws they sent me. So really, that's nothing a piece of duct tape wouldn't correct, but you shouldn't have to do that on a brand new saw. This piece of plastic moves as the saw tilts to kind of close it off here, and on the second one they sent me, it was actually hooked inside of this metal part here, which basically means you couldn't actually tilt the saw because it was all jammed up there, and it was pretty tricky to unhook that. Again, kind of a quality issue. Now let's get back to this part here being a little bit bent. If I put a straight edge next to it, you can see it's really not that straight. And I was thinking, well, that's going to mess up the alignment of the blade with respect to the slots. Now the funny thing is, on both saws they sent me, this part was bent. That's about 40 thou from the front edge to the back edge, or about 1 millimeter. Let's turn the blade by 90 degrees and check it again. Still same thing. And the blade itself, actually right now is not bad. That's only about 5 thou worth of wobble. The way the blade is misaligned, if I put the fence on it here, it'll be closer to the fence here than here. So at least it doesn't pinch the blade as long as the fence is on the right side. And if I make the blade touch the fence on the front edge, I can still push it quite a ways against the fence on the back. The fence is actually something about the saw that I quite like, because it's a fence that locks on the back and on the front, yet it squares itself up. Even if it's crooked, as soon as I tighten it, it squares itself up before it locks on the back. So that's kind of the best of both worlds. It locks itself square, but then it's quite rigid because it's locked on both ends. Okay, maybe not super rigid. I guess this is something that can be adjusted a little bit. Here's another thing that's quite nice about this saw. It's got a soft start. It also regulates the speed of the motor so it doesn't really spin out of control like one of these really awful saws do. There's definitely two classes of job site saws. The really cheap ones, which can be bought for on the order of $100, and then this type of saw, which typically costs about $400. That's prices in Canadian dollars. These ones, just awful. These ones, I was hoping this would be comparable to something like a hybrid table saw, but it's a job site saw, and I've looked at other job site saws, and I don't really like any of them. None of them really makes a good substitute for a hybrid table saw or a cabinet maker saw. Look at that, a white mouse. Holy crap. No, it's a ferret. Where is that sucker? There he is. Oh. Come on, out with you. Into my trap. I can't find that creature anymore, but it sure is cute. Not like a rat or a mouse. Suffice it to say, I wouldn't be chasing any white-level mouse-like creature in a sponsored video. This miter gauge feels nice and solid, but in the slot, it has the usual amount of play for a saw like this. So I figured they must have just cut these slots a little bit too wide. But then I was going to try some of my jigs on this saw. Here's my Kwikset 10 jig, and it just won't drop in the slot. It won't slide, it won't go in. So there's a problem, this slot is too tight. So measuring this slot with some calipers, the slot measures 745 thou. That's 5 thou too small, or about 1/10 of a millimeter. Which means anything that's 3/4 of an inch won't fit in there, unless, like this, it's quite a ways undersized. And because I make my jigs to have very little play in the slot, none of my jigs actually fit on there because they're all exactly 3/4 of an inch, and this is too small. I think they probably forgot to take into account the thickness of the paint that they put on here. Here's another thing I like about this saw. The depth adjust mechanism feels very smooth and solid. And then for the angle adjust, loosen this, and this turns also nice and smooth and easily. The saw has a pretty decent sized table for a job site saw, and like most of them, it can be expanded this way so it can rip up to 2 feet or 24 inches wide, that's 60 centimeters. And it also has this outfeed support that can be pulled out. And this is sloped on here a little bit, so if your workpiece drops down a little bit by the time it gets to here, it pushes it back up. On some saws, this would be an optional accessory. And here's comparing it to my homemade table saw. They both have about the same table size, although this one doesn't expand and the rip capacity is much less. The homemade one is also quite a bit louder. Another thing about this saw, the way the insert works, it's very shallow, and the way it's split in the back makes it just about impossible to make your own zero clearance insert. But this is actually a complaint I have with job site saws in general. In fact, most modern table saws with a riving knife, it's very difficult to make your own zero clearance inserts for. The saw comes with a plastic push stick, and it's the right style of push stick as far as I'm concerned, but these should really be used in pairs, and it only comes with one. My expectation had been that a good job site saw would be usable in a way that I use my hybrid table saw, which is for cutting precision joinery and that sort of stuff. But this saw, like most job site saws, just isn't up to it. I kind of got a perspective on this when I visited my sister, and she has another brand of job site saw, and it was in rough shape, but they used it just for outside construction, and that's what these saws are meant for. And the fact that the sawdust drops out the bottom or that it's not super precise really doesn't matter for that sort of thing. So the company that sells these saws often has deep discounts. The regular price for the saw is $450 Canadian. I don't think it's worth quite that much. I've seen it discounted by $100, which I think is about the right price. And sometimes they'll discount things by half price. And at half price, or even at $250, I would say that is a good deal that I would recommend despite its flaws. So those of you that follow my YouTube channel will know exactly what brand of saw this is. Please don't mention it in the comments. If you do, I will delete them, because the company did pay me for some other videos, and well, I don't want to hurt them unnecessarily. But lots of people have been asking, what about this saw? What about this saw? Now you know about this saw. So if I shim this behind here a little bit, I've got a cardboard shim to stick in there. It might bring it into alignment. Well, that just cut the misalignment down to less than half of what it used to be. So there's still hope for this saw. The thing with cheap tools is you just got to be willing to tinker. It's now a week later, and I was just playing around with the saw tilted at 45 degrees when I noticed this. It seems this trunnion back here has got quite a bit of play in it. So there's a whole millimeter of play in here. And the 0 degree stop seems to not be terribly firm. And that's because it's against the table here, and that table just isn't that rigid. You can see the whole table bulge up as I try to turn it past 0.